Dear colleagues, good morning. It's my great pleasure to start this webinar today. I will introduce to you our guest in a second, but I also want to introduce my co-host, Jan Crawford, who will do the questions and answers at the end. Jan is the professor of education at Trossier School of Education, and we're or co-organizing this series with Trossier, and I hope we will continue our partnership with our neighbors, literally across the street. So, Jan and Rob, thank you for joining us today. And I have a great pleasure of introducing you to Tony Liddicoat, Professor of Applied Linguistics at the Center of Applied Linguistics at the University of Warwick, Ed, the adjunct professor in the School of Communication, International Studies and Languages at the University of South Australia. So, Professor Liddicoat is also one of the founding editors of the journal Current Issues on Language Planning, and he's an executive editor of this journal. So, Professor Liddicoat will continue um, our conversation about intercultural competence, and we've heard from three distinguished colleagues um, uh, and heard their views on what intercultural competence and what intercultural education is and is not. So we're so excited to hear your view and hear about your experience in that. Tony, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation to be with you today. I'll just share my screen and we'll make a start. Okay, so what I'm talking about today is this, really a combination of things that I've been doing recently around criticality in language learning, combined with some things that I've been doing for quite a while on pedagogical approaches. And I want to bring some of that newer work and some of that older work into relationship in this presentation. So what I'm going to do basically is talk about the idea of criticality in language education. And in particular, the way I've been thinking about and working with criticality. Then I want to look at some of the consequences that a critical perspective in language learning has for how we go about and conceptualizing language education as a field of work. And then I want to look at some principles and processes for supporting that intercultural focus. And this is where I'm going to be talking about some things that have been around in my work for a little bit longer. I'm thinking about how they fit into that critical model. So firstly, in terms of criticality, what I'm thinking about is an emphasis on criticality that's very much characterized by an emphasis on self-reflexivity in teaching and learning. And this idea has come out of my reading of Habermas' work in particular, and he's thinking about the nature of critical education. Now, Habermas is not talking about language education, but I think the sorts of ways he talks about criticality are really interesting for reflecting on in the field of teaching languages and cultures. And so the critical dimension then is associated with self-reflexivity and with transformation of the self through education. So the experience of language learning then is going to be an experience of coming to know yourself and coming to take new forms of agency as a result of your language learning. Now, Habermas, in his writing about critical theory, actually argues that education is absolutely fundamental to any critical view of society as an emancipatory process. And here it differs a little bit from the way Freire talks about criticality and emancipation, because in this sense, we're not necessarily talking about the oppressed, as in Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, for example, being transformed, criticality, but rather a more wide-ranging transformation. And in particular, for those of us who are teaching in the global north, quite often the people we're teaching are actually the dominant group rather than the non-dominant group. And so some of the work on criticality sort of needs to be adapted a little bit for working in that place. However, we should also be thinking about the potential power relationships and so on that exist for second language learners, regardless of their positioning in their home societies. Now, fundamentally, Habermas is arguing about education as emancipatory in terms of education allowing people to become self-determining social actors. And in this particular body of work, then, we're actually looking at the language learner as a self-determining social actor in a new language, in new cultural context, and so on. Now, in Habermas's work, he talks about reflective appropriation, and some of the work based on Habermas has talked about that as the reflective appropriation of human life. Habermas does a bit more in terms of knowledge, but I rather like this idea of the reflective appropriation of human life, that is taking human life and making it your own. And then in language learning, taking human life expressed in another culture and its language and so on as part of that appropriation. So making the other your own, in a sense. And working out ways of being in the world across and between languages and cultures. So this reflexive appropriation in Habermas's work centrally involves becoming critically aware of how and why our assumptions are the way they are. And in my work, I'm really interested in the assumptions about language and culture. And Habermas argues that our assumptions about the way the world is constrain the ways we perceive the world. So in language learning, the way we perceive our assumptions about language and culture are going to influence how we perceive others and others' acts of meaning making. So critical awareness in language education, I believe, involves two critical dimensions. Firstly, it involves understanding one's own linguistic and cultural situatedness in acts of communication. That is, coming to understand what one's language and what one's cultural experiences bring to that act of participation in communication in any language, and how that then impacts when you start to change features of language and its cultural context. The other dimension that's important is that it enables the exercise of agency in future acts of communication. That is, being critical and developing a critical understanding of language and culture and the implicatedness of language and culture in acts of communication allows people to make decisions about how they will enact being themselves in the language, rather than simply reproducing the norms of others. So much teaching, in fact, in my own experiences of language learning, this has been the way culture is taught, is how to be like the native speakers. I don't think that is an appropriate target. That what language education should be doing is fostering critical engagement with others, not assimilation to others. And the engagement that we need has to be an informed engagement. That is, making decisions for ourselves about how we're going to use the linguistic and cultural repertoires at our disposal in order to act within a language and its cultural context. Now, to start to think about language education like that means starting to question some of our fundamental starting assumptions about language education and think about what sorts of things need to be emphasized in theory and practice in the field. So one of these things is how we understand language. That is, what is it that is being learned in a language program? And I think language education needs to move and is moving beyond those traditional concepts of grammar and vocabulary and communication in terms of reading, writing, speaking, and listening. That's a very construct in many ways. I'm not saying it's a wrong construct. My thinking about this is that we need to expand views rather than replace views. And we also need to reconsider the idea of languages as discrete and separated. And here, work in translanguaging, for example, by people like Li Wei and Fede Garcia, has really been quite influential in my thinking about this. And Li Wei and argued that we need to be thinking of the multilingual, plurilingual repertoire as a single repertoire. And in a sense, this means that the meaning-making potential of all languages are engaged simultaneously, that we don't move between English and French, for example. We are selecting from a repertoire that is made up of things that would be called in French, and we're trying to make selections from those repertoires that are appropriate for particular contexts and meaning. And this means that our languages, and I would argue our cultures as well, are always simultaneously present and simultaneously influencing what goes on in communication. And so I believe we need to start emphasizing language as a meaning-making system. We need to start thinking about language as offering tools for communicating things about self, world, other, and so on, rather than as simply as structural systems that become tools for some form of communication. That language is much more symbolic than perhaps it has been represented in a lot of classroom practice. And the thing that we need to bear in mind with this is that language is not simply the thing that sits in the grammar books. Language is something that's individual, personal, created in communication. Language is alive and developing. By saying that language is individual, I'm saying that through language and through languages, we understand and present ourselves as particular people, that each individual makes selections from that wider repertoire that's available to all speakers of the language to construct a certain way of being in the language. So we need to move beyond this system of codified norms, the forms of language, standard language, and so on, which, as I said, are important, but also recognize the personal and the identity function of language in language teaching and the impacts of a new language on that sense of self that comes as a human being using a language. And we also need to be thinking about language as being culturally contexted, that is, a culturally contexted meaning-making practice, that language does not exist independently of other things, and that language and culture always come into relationship and function together in the creation and interpreting of meanings. For example, one of the things I've been very aware of in the last 6.5 years since I moved from Australia to the United Kingdom is how different the English language is here from what I'm used to as a speaker of Australian English. So one of the things that I had enormous difficulty with here, or had enormous difficulty with when I first arrived, was the question, are you all right? Everyone was asking me every day, are you all right? When I first arrived, I thought it was nice and caring, and then quickly became quite disillusioned and annoyed by the question. And I realized at that particular time, the way my Australian experiences of interpretation of that language form were actually at variance with my interlocutors' experiences of interpreting it. And I'd actually been hearing a question that said, do you have any problems? Is there something the matter? And they'd been hearing a question at the beginning of a conversation. So for me, it wasn't part of that little ritual of English language speakers at the beginning of an interaction. It was a legitimate question, assuming there was a problem. And that had nothing to do with the language meaning of the utterance. The words were the same in Australia and in this part of the UK. What was different was the culturally contexted meaning of that particular thing. Which brings us to sort of thinking about how we address culture. And I think one of the things we need to be thinking about in language education, once we adopt a more critical perspective, is to move away from what calls culturalism. That is the idea that cultures are monolithic, essentialized and static, and are focused around the nation. This has been the standard representation of cultures in most language textbooks for a very long time. And those that move beyond the single culture really start to reproduce multiple monolithic, essentialized and static national cultures from different places, from pluricentric languages. So we need to move beyond the idea of this is what the French are like, or this is what the British are like, and so on, to a more sophisticated understanding of culture, drawing in particular on work that's been coming out of cultural studies. So we need to start seeing cultures as contingent, as created, as highly variable, as evolving in the moment and created in the moment, that there are parts that come from the past, but there are parts that come into being in those moments of communication. And what we need to be thinking of, particularly in teaching languages, is the idea of cultures as frames that allow for purposeful social life for a social group. That cultures are not simply there as constructs, they're there as purposes. They enable things to happen in particular ways. They enable the world to be seen as functioning in particular ways. They enable us to have a sense of ourselves and our place within the social group. And in this sense, culture becomes a meaning-making resource. It is one of those things that enables us to see things are meaningful, that things have a communicative value, that the way you look, dress, act, speak are not just there, they're there at a symbolic level. And in doing this, we need to start to think about intercultural communication not simply as being relevant in those moments of cultural breakdown, which is where a lot of work in intercommunication is actually focused. Now, those moments of breakdown, when meanings are not exchanged, are actually highly powerful and important for bringing to our awareness the impact of languages and cultures on communication. But in reality, what is going on in any communication is a reciprocal process of meaning making and interpretation between individuals who have different bodies of knowledge and different individualized language practices. So the distance and the gaps may be different when you're involved in communicating in a language that's not your first language, in a cultural context which is not the one you've been socialized into, and so on. But it's a difference of degree, not type, between those situations, and that reflecting on those differences of degrees and type are actually core to the critical enterprise in language teaching and learning. And once we start to move into this more critical framing, we need to recognize that the locus of attention in learning about another culture is not the study of the other, but the study of the self in engagement with the other. That is, when one engages with someone who speaks another language, who has been socialized into another cultural context, what is going on tells us as much about ourselves and often more about ourselves than it tells us about the other. And so we need to move the locus of attention from simply trying to understand the other in a very anthropological sort of mode to understanding ourselves in the process of interaction with the other, in which case we have a different ethical dimension to the focus of culture learning. That the ethical dimension then comes in terms of accepting responsibility for one's place in that reciprocal exchange of meaning. Also, the ideas of learning, I think, need some rethinking. A lot of the learning theories are very powerful in language education at the moment has come to us from second language acquisition. And one of the things that I think has been really problematic in a lot of thinking in language education has been the dichotomy that has been established between acquisition and learning, coming from the work of Krashen back in the 1980s. Particularly the idea that the real process of acquiring a language is through unconscious hypothesis formation based on input. I'm not saying it's not part of the process. Thinking it is the process is quite problematic, especially when we move beyond a focus very narrowly on grammar and vocabulary. And that we need to be thinking much more of the role of learning. There's conscious processes of developing representations as part of what goes on in language learning. One of the things that's been quite influential for me has been sociocultural theory based on the work of Vygotsky, which has been quite influential of late in second language acquisition, viewing learning as socially and culturally situated, and recognizing the place of language and culture in the act of learning, and recognizing the role of interaction and socialization in the role of learning. A lot of the work in SLA coming from Vygotsky has still tended to focus on language as code rather than language as meaning making. But a lot of that thinking about scaffolding, about languaging and so on is actually really very important, I think, for our thinking. But I think it's really important to start to look at learning from outside second language acquisition. And there are two sets of work that have actually been quite influential for me in thinking about what learning might actually be in a language education program. And the first of those is a paper by Anna Svard, who was writing on mathematics education at the time, who argued that there are two dominant metaphors in education about learning. That we can learn through what she calls acquisition, which is different from the Krashen sense of acquisition. It's the idea that knowledge is transmitted from a knower to somebody who wants to know it. It's Svard likens it to the mind as a filing cabinet, where something is in one mind and you move that something to another mind through rather conventional processes of instruction. And the other metaphor is engagement in communities of practice, doing things with others in order to be socialized into the life of the other. And those two metaphors are actually really quite powerful. But what I found most powerful about Svard's work is the idea that a learning theory needs both of those dimensions. And I think learning theory has quite often been unbalanced in a sense in language education. particularly under the impact of communicative language teaching. In the early 2000s, I'll give you the date there, Paavola and some colleagues in Finland working in science education actually went back to Svard's work and argued that there was something missing from her model, that we needed to think of not just acquiring knowledge through acquisition and participation, where knowledge is known by someone and is being transmitted in some way to someone else, either through instruction or collaborative doing, but also that learning can involve knowledge creation. That is, in the act of learning, we discover things that were not known at the beginning, not only not known by the learner, but potentially not known by the teacher. That learning is a process of discovering what's going on in the world. And that discovery can sometimes confirm what was known earlier, but sometimes create something new. And for me, that was quite a powerful metaphor for learning, because it opens the space for thinking that when it comes to processes of interpretation, we have potentials to go beyond the known and start to form ideas for ourselves. And I think that's really quite important in intercultural learning. Again, Paavola and colleagues actually argue that we need all three metaphors, that there is no one theory of learning, it's built up into complexity. My colleague Angela Scarino and I were very influenced by those ideas and started to think that there was something missing still in those three models. And we started to argue for learning as a hermeneutic process. That is, learning as a process of coming to understand that which is not understood. So learning is not simply about knowledge transfer and knowledge creation, but it's also about the process of understanding, not just knowing. And we see the learner as somebody who is interpreting experience, working understanding through critical reflection on experience. So we're coming back to that idea of criticality much more strongly, that when you see learning as a process of coming to make sense of something, that reflexive engagement with the reality of experience becomes very important. So thinking in those terms, how we understand the learning that we produce through language education takes on some different dimensions from the traditional models. The first is that typically we've thought about learning in terms of understood as we do now, in terms of the ability to do things as described by a scale, whether it's the TOEFL scale or the IELTS scale or the Common European Framework of Reference scales or the TOEFL scales or whatever they happen to be. We have this sense of measuring language abilities against set levels. Now, the problem with proficiency as the main of learning, again, I'm not saying it's the wrong focus of learning, I'm talking more here about emphasis, is that they've tended to focus on the idea of the native speaker, and the native speaker as the ideal speaker hearer of language in Chomsky's term. And viewing the learner as progressing from less native speaker-like states to more native speaker-like states. And so we have this native speaker norm that prevails in framings of proficiency. And I think the big problem here is the native speaker as the sole model for the language learner. Particularly, as Crouch pointed out quite some time ago, the native speaker is conceptualized monolingually and monoculturally in these contexts. And that's the real problem here, the monolingual, monocultural thing, because the second language learner does not become or aim to become a monolingual, monocultural individual in another language. Rather, is going to become a person who has multiple languages and therefore participates in multiple cultures. And as Byram and Sarat pointed out back in the early 90s, plurilingual and pluricultural individuals have different needs and different abilities that native speakers do not have. And so we need to be developing within the second language learner things that are not present in the native speaker. And the particular construct of that, and Byram and Zahat called this the intercultural speaker, is an individual who can communicate with people who don't share the same starting points or interpersonal and interactive practices that are found in context, and that come with using this complex linguistic repertoire made up of things from different places, different cultural contextualizations, and so on. And in particular, the emphasis in being a speaker of more than one language is not simply on producing ideas in linguistic form, but moving ideas between one language and another. For example, as a speaker of French, as a second language speaker of French, I don't communicate as a French thinker. I communicate as a person who has ideas and experiences formed in English that need to be articulated and communicated in French to people who don't know the constructs that are involved in the English and the English cultural context and experience that I have. So it's a process not simply of speaking, but reinterpreting, translating, yes, but not at the simple level of code change, but translating in the sense of moving something from one conceptual frame to another, and then moving practice from being framed in one cultural context to being framed in different cultural contexts. So there's this constant process of moving backwards and forwards that's not recognized in the idea of proficiency in the native speaker. So then, coming back to interculturality then, teaching for critical learning is going to involve a movement away from a focus on culture and understanding of others to a focus on understanding yourself and your responses to diversity. And I'm arguing this because, firstly, knowing about another culture is not the same as being interactive with people from another culture. Knowing about another culture is part of the picture, but it is not the picture. So this externalized view of the learner as the studier of the other is not a preparation for being with the other. And adapting one's communication and moving between languages and cultures. There's more to it than that. One of the things that I believe is central to intercultural learning are one's own reactions and responses to the that we encounter. Our reactions and responses can be positive or negative. They are a fact of intercultural exchange. But they need to be brought into focus in teaching, because it's in those reactions and responses that our own enculturation is made visible. So if I encounter something and I find it surprising, or I find it distasteful, that emotion of surprise and distaste actually tells me more about me as the interpreter of that experience than it does about the experience itself. And the big risk by not engaging with responses and reactions in the sense I'm talking about is that we attribute the negativity to the other. That is, you do something that surprises me, you're unpredictable. You do something that I dislike, you're a bad person. Rather than saying, you do something that I find surprising, what is it that makes it surprising to me? And returning to the self. So returning to that self the critical self-reflexivity of the Habermasian idea of criticality. So interpretive learning, then, if we're going to engage interculturally with language, means that we need to view every text, and that's text that's written, spoken, visual, multimedia, or whatever, as an experience of meaning making. So when we read a tweet, when we read a blog post, when we read a newspaper, when we read a novel, when we view a television program, we are not simply engaged in an act of information transfer. We are engaged as a participant in the world that created that text, either as a recipient of that text, or as a producer of that text, or in that complex interaction between producer and receiver that happens in social interactions. So this means that the language needs not only to be comprehended or produced, but its meaning-making potential needs to be investigated and reflected on. We need to be thinking of this as an instantiation of cultural practice, not just a language artifact. So in working around these sorts of ideas, my colleagues and I have been working with a set of 5 principles that we think is pretty fundamental to how we need to engage with language and culture in the classroom. The first of these, which grows out of Vygotskian sociocultural learning theory very strongly, is the idea of active construction. Active construction refers to learning as a discovery process. Learning, it links very closely to this idea of learning as making sense that I talked about earlier. That the way we approach a language and culture outside the classroom is to find things out. And so in the classroom, we need experiences, supported experiences of finding out how things are as they go. So the teaching approach is not an instructional one where the teacher comes in and says, this is what the culture is like, this is what the language is like, but a discovery one where the teacher says, here is something that is an experience of language and culture being used for communication. What do you see? What do you make of it? How do you bring yourself to an interpretation of it? And then thinking about how the understanding emerged as your understanding. So this is a very student-centered approach, but one where the process of discovery of the things in the experience are more important than the teacher telling you about the experience. And that means that the teacher expertise here is in this of discovering, not in the cultural content. And quite often teachers are required to work with cultural content that is not familiar to them. And there is always going to be cultural content that's not familiar to us because we are not participants in all possible cultures. Even if we think of ourselves as members of one particular linguistic community, we certainly don't know how every potential cultural group community is going to communicate. I have no idea, for example, how 14-year-olds in the United Kingdom communicate. I've never encountered a 14-year-old in the United Kingdom, so I have simply no experience of that. I have vanishingly small experience of the sorts of people in the Australian context as well. I do not know how to enact being a 14-year-old, and at my age, I don't think any 14-year-old would be very happy if I attempted it. The next dimension is making connections that, when again in the real world, the way we make sense of things is by connecting the known with the unknown. That the languages and cultures that we experience are not done in isolation. They're done through the lens of previous experience. And so learners need to learn and to be supported in learning the connections between the new and the known. and I use new and known here rather than first language and second language, first culture and second, firstly because those are two monolithic as constructions, but also the what is known from experience of using all languages and cultures. It's any past knowledge. It's not connecting first culture, second culture, for example. It's connecting experience so far with new experience. And those experiences can come through many languages, not just what we would consider first language and target language. Another principle here is social interaction. I think this is really quite fundamental because it's in the act of interacting with others that we construct knowledge, that we come to understand interpretation. We need to be exchanging ideas because that exchange of ideas is part of the engagement with diversity. Within there are diversities of responses, and those diversities are part of the investigation. They're part of the confrontation that comes through these processes of engagement with others. But we also need to see social action as the goal of learning. And I don't mean social interaction in the form of conversation. I mean that the way we use language is for people to interact with others in writing and speaking in whatever mode, and that we need to build a repertoire of capabilities that can be used for social purposes, and that what we're doing in language use is selecting from repertoires the things that will enable us to achieve social purposes. Reflection is a central principle in all of this, that we need reflection as a fundamental part of learning. It's a fundamental part of Habermas's view of learning as emancipatory and as transformational. It's fundamental to the idea that I was talking about earlier about learning being hermeneutic, that we need to be engaged in a process of reflection that is both affective and cognitive. There are lots of emotions in encountering diverse others, and they need to be brought into the reflective process. I argued before that responses and reactions are absolutely fundamental. And in this process of reflection, we need to bring students to positions of decentering, that is, starting to see things from perspectives beyond their own. And this was fundamental to Habermas in ideas of criticality as well, that it is when we start to see ourselves from the perspective of the other, others from their own perspectives, as well as seeing the other from our own perspective, that we begin to understand the complexity of enculturation, of the linguistic and cultural impacts on self and communication. And we need to move to these new perspectives to begin to see the world in different ways. The final principle we talk about is responsibility, that is accepting responsibility for your own ways of interacting with others in and across languages. That is taking sole responsibility. Responsibility for interactions are shared, obviously, but one has to accept one's place within that. And as a learner of another language, participating in other cultural contexts, one needs to strive continuously to understand oneself and the other in an ongoing process, that intercultural learning is never completed. And we need to be seeing the knowledge that we gain from our experiences as having consequences for future use. That is, use a language in the future should change as the result of your learning, or if it doesn't change, there should be an understanding of why it won't change. In this form of teaching, we've done a lot of work around processes of noticing, comparing, reflecting, and interacting. So I just want to talk about those briefly. So the processes that I presented are presented in a circle with multiple there's no one real entry point for this process, that reflection can lead to noticing, comparing, and so on. But I'm going to talk about them in the order beginning with noticing here, because in the classroom, it is often the most effective starting point for teaching. When a learner is exposed to language and culture in textual form as an experience, the thing to do with it is to see what's there. That is, identify information that is relevant to the student's purposes. Recognizing what is new, what is different, what is known, what is unknown, and so on. Recognizing what you react to. So teachers need to support learners in noticing what is in an experience, that it doesn't come naturally. Some things are observed and not understood as being observed. And it's not until you're aware of the noticing that it becomes available for critical attention. The next stage is comparing. I don't mean comparing simply in terms of finding similarities and differences between sources of information, similarities and differences between your previous experience and the new experience. That's the first step, if you like. But what's important is that the process of comparing needs to involve identifying relationships between different pieces of information. Going beyond a simple dichotomy, us, them understanding of the world, to something that is much more complex and nuanced, and recognizing interrelationships between similarities and differences. We build in reflection again as a process, not just a principle. And that's actually done very deliberately, because we think reflecting is absolutely essential to intercultural learning. So reflecting is about drawing conclusions and consequences of experience, making sense of it, coming to understand it, because it's in that process of coming to understand that one begins to have agency in terms of what one discovers through the experience. So we need to gain insights into the way that knowledge is adapted and changed as the result of new information. That when we have one experience of linguistic action in a cultural context, it can confirm things that happened earlier, it can challenge things that happened earlier. We need to understand how our knowledge is progressing over time and building not just in terms of a linear progression, but more something rhizomatic or web-like, that is processes of interconnection that are important. And we need to understand how our learning is developing. The fourth principle, interacting, goes very closely with social interaction and involves learners discussing peers and teachers the insights that they've got. It's the verbalizing, the languaging of insight that makes the process of interpretation come to fruition, really. That without that process of communicating one's ideas, the ideas often remain unformed or partly formed, but also in interaction, the ideas can be challenged and developed. But this new learning then has to be communicated with others in speech, in writing, in image, and so on, so that learners are going through this process of articulating for their understanding, because that articulation for others is also an articulation for self. So what's the role of the teacher in all of this? Well, I said before that the teacher's knowledge is not the same in the sort of perspective I'm teaching about. The traditional teacher is seen as the all-knowing individual who has the knowledge the learner needs, and not knowing the answer to a student's question is considered to be challenging. The interculturally focused teacher is not only a source of knowledge, they do have knowledge. They're not only a model providing input, as in the community of language teaching paradigm. They are both of these things, but they're more. But the real expertise that the teacher needs to bring into the classroom is working through that process of coming to understand. That is, they support the students' discovery of meaning in texts, not tell students what to understand from text. And so the expertise is process, not product focus. So the teacher's job then is to provide experiences of language and culture in communication. That is, by exposing learners to texts. And as I said, by text, I don't simply mean written text. I mean texts in any communicative mode, that any instance of language use is an experience. That is, it's a text. And that the teacher then supports engagement with knowledge in those experiences by, firstly, constructing tasks that reveal how language and culture are used in meaning-making interpretation, and tasks that promote analysis and reflection, in addition to comprehension. So we need to move beyond the sense of understanding the text to interpreting the experience that comes from reading the text, participating in the text, viewing the text, whatever it happens to be. This means the teacher needs to provide relevant scaffolding for those processes, noticing, comparing, reflecting, interacting. And teachers' questions are really, it's teachers' questions that build the types of learning you want to see. It's not teachers' instruction that builds the learning, it's teachers' questions that are absolutely fundamental. And we also need to be leaving open the forms that answers will take and the focus of interest. Now, when we're teaching, we always have a sense of what we think our learners should get from a text. And that's legitimate and valuable. It allows us to plan what could happen and give support when students are struggling to see. But we shouldn't be predicting the nature of the answer, because when learning is interpretation, we need to recognize that each interpretation grows out of previous experience, and every learner's previous experience will be different from ours and different from each other's. And so we're looking at a context in which the learner makes their own answer from their own interpretation based on experience. Now, as teachers, we can challenge that, we can question that, we can get them to develop their thinking and evidence their thinking and so on. But it's working, it's not rejecting the answer, it's pushing the answer forward that we need to be thinking about. We also should allow space for learners themselves to determine the focus of interest. What it is that interests us as a teacher might not be what a learner needs to get from the experience, because again, their previous experiences will point them in different directions that are consequential for their own thinking development. Finally, I want to argue for language learning as a conceptually focused activity, particularly when we start to draw on the cultural dimensions of language programs. That what we need to be thinking of is the meaningful dimension of culture, not the descriptive dimension of culture. There's an example here that I use with my own students, and I thought it would be useful to show it to you as well. It's a very simple example that is drawn from what my students are likely to be teaching in their schools and in their textbooks. But the way that cultural information tends to be presented at the moment in textbooks are what I would call descriptions. That is, they talk about what the reality is like. And so if you're doing a topic like food, you would expect to see names of food, comparisons of food eaten in different countries, comparisons of ways of eating in different countries, knife and fork versus chopsticks, and so on. I think we've all seen food type lessons like that. When we start to move to a concept, we open the place for exploration, we open the place for meaning making. So we can ask questions such as what counts as food and why does it count as food? Different as food for different people. Insects, by and large, don't count as food for me. Dogs don't count as food for me. There are many things that don't count as food for me that might count as food for others. So why don't they count as food for me? It's not their nutritional value that is the reason. There's a meaning theme going on there. So we need to explore the meaning of food. What is good and bad food and why? That is actually a very culturally contexted thing. Things that I think of as good food, you may not good food. When is it appropriate to eat particular foods and why? Again, the fact that we have cereal and coffee for breakfast has got nothing to do with the nutritional properties of cereal and coffee. And it's perfectly legitimate to eat curry and rice for breakfast as well. So why is it that we think that certain foods are allocated to certain times? Why do we eat? I mean, obviously it's a biological reason, but we eat not just because we eat for very complex reasons. Why do we eat what we eat? Again, that is very complex. What do our diets show about people? What do our diets show about our values and expectations about food? You can see that those sorts of questions open up possibilities for engaging in completely different ways from the more descriptive approach. So by way of conclusion, I'd just like to reiterate a couple of points. Firstly, that intercultural teaching is not teaching about other cultures, it's teaching about the self in relation to diversity, that the other cultures provide the content for this learning in the form of experiences of language and culture and communication. They are not the end product. The end product is to understand what one takes from that, how the act of communication influences oneself. And that constant return to the self is really important in the critical perspective that I'm arguing for. That the learning aim is for learners to come to understand themselves as enculturated beings through the enculturation of others. That is, we're actually very good at seeing others as having culture. We're not so good at seeing ourselves as being influenced by languages and cultures. So the ways that our languages shape our worldview, the way our cultural experiences shape our worldview, is absolutely fundamental to the recognition of how those same things shape the practice and worldview of others. And then learning itself is a self-discovery through a critical reflection of responses and reactions to diversity. So those responses and reactions, that emotional dimension of engagement with the other, is absolutely fundamental. So I'm going to stop the presentation now, and we can have some questions. Okay.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
For so many reasons. I want to turn to anyone who I have tons of questions and I'm excited, but I want to first turn to my colleagues. If anyone would like to ask a question in the audio channel or in the text, please feel free to do so now. And as folks are writing their question, maybe I could kick it off with one question.
Go ahead.
If that's okay. Yeah. Oh, fantastic. So one thing that has come up often in many of our language classes, and I work with a lot of language teachers who work in bilingual contexts or multilingual contexts here in Los Angeles, like the dual language, bilingual education, or 2A immersion education, is thinking about, when we're thinking about this idea of intercultural education as in relation to diversity, then how our learners, as well as our language teachers and ourselves, relate to that diversity differently, and how we sort of, I guess I'm wondering if you have any insights on how you think of within this framework of these 5 processes, or within your own experience, how to negotiate power and different access, and sort of something that a lot of, I think, not my teachers that I work with run up against is the different ways of making meaning and doing language, how those learners are differently positioned, and have different access to identity groups based on all sorts of subjectivities, whether that's race or gender or religion, or immigration status, etc. So I was wondering if you could talk us through how some of that negotiation of power, and differential access, is built into your framework, or if you have any suggestions as we hit up against some of those different sets of access or different sets of power.
I mean, one of the things that comes from thinking of language and culture use as experience, I think is really important, because it's in those moments of experience that those moments of power or lack of power become obvious to people and then become available for reflection. One of the difficulties, I think, for teachers is the position themselves as the most powerful person in the classroom, ultimately, even though it doesn't seem like it some days. You are the person who actually gets to set the agenda in that classroom. And your role as a model of the acceptance of multiple interpretations is actually really important. So different learners, because of their enculturation, are bringing different epistemologies in the classroom. And if you, the teacher, simply validate the epistemology of the dominant group in your society, then you're actually closing down the legitimacy of those other epistemologies. So firstly, the teacher is the model of someone who accepts epistemologies and can challenge them without falsifying them. And I think that's really important, that there are things that are going to come into those contexts that we personally don't agree, that we wouldn't want our students to leave our classroom agreeing with. But we don't deal with that by rejecting the view. We do that by encouraging further thought about the view and not closing down the conversation. I think that is a really important dimension. The other thing is to be honest about power, where it's present, not to brush it under the carpet, but to have it there in discussions at moments when it's significant. And one of the things that's really interesting, I think, about being a language learner is that the language learner is incredibly disempowered in all contexts. So one of the few possibilities that the average white cisgendered heterosexual male has in many societies to feel disempowered is to learn another language. It's very challenging to be disempowered in that context, but to actually reflect on what that sense of disempowerment might actually mean for yourself. But also for those who are minorities, what empowerment they get from being positioned communicatively at the same level as those who traditionally had more power, and actually reflecting on the nature of the experience of being a second language user and how that positions you differently in different contexts. I think that's not the complete solution, but those are some things I think are really interesting about the languages field for engaging in this sense of power, because as you move into different linguistic and cultural groups, your personal empowerment changes. And reflecting on that and the vulnerability of power, perhaps, can be a really interesting thing to do.
Thank you so much. That's so fascinating. Thinking about becoming a particular version of yourself as a inquiry process in the classroom that's negotiated with others and all your identities is so fascinating. There were several questions in the chat, and I don't know if Haggett or Emmy had a question or a comment as well. I'll defer to my colleagues first, and then if not, I'll go to the questions in the chat.
So the first question is from Tin Yu, and the question is about novice learners and at the beginning of their learning. Yeah, I think this is a really important issue at two levels. First, my starting point is that we have to start getting people to think this way right at the beginning of language learning. We can't leave it until the end. I think one of the things that actually happens is if we don't start to engage critically with language at the beginning of learning, people end up with so many assumptions that we haven't tracked and realized that we then have to undo everything that's happened previously. However, we should recognize learners' starting points in doing this. So a lot of the work that I've actually done with school teachers and very young learners, and they're really interesting to work with, because if you've got somebody who's in the first years of school beginning a language, they don't have a lot to draw on in those contexts. And so you need to build the focus that is appropriate for them conceptually in terms of experience and so on. And that seems some teachers do some absolutely fun, wonderful things with very young children. For older learners who are beginners, it's a different sort of process, that they're engaging with something that is very unfamiliar in many senses. And we often think that older learners are going to be better at reflection, at noticing, at all of those sorts of things, and frankly, they're not. So one of the things that we need to work with learners who are new to this sort of experience is building towards greater abilities in terms of noticing and reflecting, comparing, and so on, and easing them into it. So we don't start them at the end point, we start them at the beginning. We start, so for some learners, it might simply be that what they need to do is recognize that diversity exists before they can even start to engage with diversity as a concept and start to reflect upon it and so on. So we need to know our learners quite well. And one of the things that I found quite powerful is the reflection on that when the expertise is your understanding of something rather than the teacher's understanding, there is more scope for you to bring in yourself and to have yourself validated in some ways by the teacher. And so that's one of the things that can aid against that sort of negative emotional self-isolation dimension in the group. So reflecting on yourself and how you make sense of things rather than expecting people to perform particular behaviors or particular forms of thinking and so on. But really, ultimately, it comes down to knowing the starting points of your learners and where they can enter into it and matching your instruction to those starting points.
I think there's an additional question as well around not only such an awesome question. Haggy, I think, had a comment and a question.
Yeah.
And then,
Okay.
Please.
No, I wanted to just reiterate what my colleagues have said before, that it's definitely a very well presented topic that is, we are dealing with it from, as you know, novice level and on. And it dawned on me that you're so right about saying we're such an agent, that we're the expert on the culture, and when we come into the class, I feel like I'm the source. I'm kind of the funnel through that. I'm giving them that perspective and ideas and information, and maybe it's good that I kind of I should maybe step back and ask more questions. And often I get students that have some experience with a culture within the target language I'm teaching, and they bring their own experiences, but and they ask questions, relevant questions. So why is this, and how is this, and how different linguistic patterns are developed as a reflection of the culture. So really, thank you so much for also just elevating our awareness, just even listening to things that are kind of, making our more conscientious insight about it. So I truly appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, it really is interesting work, but at one level, I think too, it's liberating for teachers to know they don't have to know the answer.
Mm-hmm.
For example, I once gave an example of me as an Australian who's a second language speaker of French, who has Malaysian in my classroom. How do I teach a Malaysian woman how to be a French speaker as a white Australian man? I have no entry into that reality. I have no way of guiding her to become a French-speaking Malaysian Muslim woman. I have expertise in helping her to work out for herself how to become a French-speaking Muslim Malaysian woman. And that's my expertise. My expertise comes from negotiating cultural difference, not from knowing about cultures. And once we recognize that expertise, I think we give really different support to different students. And different students will have different needs and experiences. Those with backgrounds in the language might actually have more challenges than people without backgrounds in the language, because diasporic communities often have really different framings of the language and culture from the target community that we normally associate with the language learning and so on. And we can't recognize and have those things under our control. And then I teach people who are 30, 40 years younger than me. How do I teach somebody how to be 30 or 40 years younger than me in that language and so on? We have all of those sorts of challenges. We're not teaching people to become white, educated, middle-class speakers of French, male speakers of French. I'm not necessarily that category myself, but the textbooks are sort of designed around that sort of persona, but it's not the persona of our learners, and it's not even the desired persona of the learners. So the really big question is, how do we enable learners to produce their desired personas?
And I think that's what Beryl Swain was claiming, that a learner is negotiating, it's a process of negotiating meaning. We can only cater some in the environment, but is in that in action of negotiating his own meaning and finding what it's relevant to him according to as each individual, and it's a constant negotiation of meaning. Yes.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is, and everyone's meaning has validity. Even if we think it's wrong, there is a certain validity to it. We might want to change some aspects of it because, okay, people come into class with racist ideas, and we want to challenge those racist ideas, but we don't do that by saying you're wrong.
Yes,
we do that by providing experiences that help them to realize alternatives. And that way of working. And with all of our students, we should be providing experiences that allow them to think for themselves of where they're going to go with this stuff. We shouldn't be requiring assimilation to a set of norms. We should be giving people the agency to decide which linguistic and cultural practices they feel they can adopt without threatening their identity, which things they can't adopt without threatening their identity, and how they're going to compensate for those things, because you can do all sorts of things that are not the way they would do it in the textbook, comprehended and comprehensible and don't offend and all of those sorts of things. But they may be something that no first language speaker of that language would ever do, but you do it that way because that's your negotiation and you do it because of your sense of agency. And if somebody says you're doing something weird, you've then got the capacity to explain where that weirdness is coming from and opening them to your perspective rather than just expecting you to take on their perspective. And in immigrant contexts in particular, that can be very powerful because the sort of dominant discourses for immigrants is you've got to be just like everybody else, yeah, rather than you've got to engage with everybody else, but as yourself. And working out that process, how to do that, I think is absolutely fundamental.
Hi, Tony. I also wanted to ask you a question, and I just realized that my question is related to what Mariana had asked in the chat, and she asked, you know, how does acquiring pragmatic competence play in your framework? And my kind of follow-up question to that is, how do you assess a pragmatic competence knowledge related to that in the classrooms? Do you have any suggestions? Because you mentioned IELTS and you mentioned TOEFL, and you know, I'm kind of approaching it in a very practical perspective as a teacher trainer myself. So is there anything that you would recommend us to look at as a form of assessment, and if acquiring pragmatic competence would be something that you would
okay, well, both of those questions. Firstly, how about acquiring pragmatic competence? Actually, that's where I started with all of this. I am by training a linguist. I used to be a syntactician. You can see how far I've moved in the sort of discussions at the moment. But for me, pragmatics is the point where language and culture come closest together. That pragmatics is meaning in context, and the cultural context of that meaning is absolutely important. And it's coming to understand that meaning is made up of not just the linguistic things, but the cultural context in which those linguistic things are done. And then thinking about how you're going to respond to that. I have a really nice interaction with a student that I've used in some presentations who was talking about being absolutely shocked in a restaurant in Japan when he saw a man order a beer simply by using the word nama, which is just shouting the word nama, which is the word for draft beer. How offended he was by that entire practice, and how he then started to think about, well, what resources do I have for asking for a beer? And decided to use one that was completely and utterly different from this man, still within the range of possibility. And so said, nama onegaishimasu, which is a rather humble, polite way to ask for a beer. And said, I'm going to do that because I wanted to show everybody I'm not like that man. And then taking on the pragmatic those utterances in order to perform identity. So I think in the teaching and learning of pragmatics, what we need to be focusing on is what is the contextualized meaning of different ways of realizing a speech act, and which meanings do you want to draw on in order to enact yourself. So it's not teaching, this is more polite, this is less polite, this is appropriately polite. It is teaching, this has this meaning value. And depending on the context, you could achieve what you wanted or couldn't. I mean, it's like Remy van Kompenol talks about rules of thumb. I really hate rules of thumb because they always lead to wrong answers. And that we need to be thinking of the complexities that underlie this and the meaning potential, and then thinking of it as a tool that we now have in our repertoire. And if I want to achieve these sorts of things, I can pull out that tool. If I want to achieve something different, I pull out that tool. Now, when it comes to assessment, that's the area I've done least work in, and I've been working on it for a while now. Not so much around pragmatics, I have to say, but the really big issue around assessing pragmatics from an intercultural perspective is that there are two absolutely fundamental dimensions, and they can't be captured in the same task. So one dimension is the performance. That is, what does the learner say, do, write in context? And that's what the traditional assessment of pragmatics is usually focused on, is knowing why they did it in that context. Because sometimes appropriate, we'll use the word appropriate, and I don't like using that because it assumes there is only one right answer, and in reality, for first language speakers, there are multiple right answers for everything. But the idea is a learner could do something appropriate and have no idea why it was appropriate. Right. Alternatively, the learner could do something inappropriate, but could do it for very good reasons. I couldn't possibly say it like that because it would offend my sense of identity and so on. So we need ways of capturing the performance and the reflection on the performance. And it's only when we've got both of those bits of information that we can make a judgment about the pragmatic learning. Now, that sort of work doesn't fit testing. We need different modeling from the standard test. So I don't see this being taken on by IELTS or TOEFL or anyone like that. We need to be much more open to holistic assessment. We need to be more open to what people call alternative assessment. What we actually need is not episodic assessment, just doing one test here and one test there, but looking at connected development over time. And the other thing that I'm looking about in the work that we've been doing is how you reference that development. And we're starting to argue, not in anything we've published yet, which is why I starting to argue, that rather than thinking about things like criterion referencing and norm referencing, we need to think about what's called ipsative referencing, which is comparing the performance of the learner against previous performance of the learner. Because the sort of development we have is pretty idiosyncratic, that it's really highly contextualized. And so what if you and I do the same task, it won't be the same task, because I will do it from my experience of somebody socialized through my entire life, and you'll do it from your experience as somebody socialized through your entire life, and our starting points will be completely and utterly different. So our endpoints are going to be completely and utterly different. You can't do the criterion and norm referencing thing. You have to reference against the individual and understand the individual. Again, IELTS and TOEFL are not going to do that. But yeah, these are really sort of some basic ideas about assessment. It's a lot more complex than that.
Thank you very much. Very helpful.
I think our time, this has been so insightful, and I felt an incredible sense of engagement and hope in listening to some of your very practical recommendations, as well as getting some clarity around criticality and how this applies to intercultural education. Thank you so much. I think many folks are heading to class or meetings at 11:30. So I'll turn it over, Tony, if you have, or Dr. Liddicoat, if you wanted to make any final comments before we wrap up.
Please call me Tony. I come from a cultural context that values ignoring hierarchy. So I'm much more comfortable being called Tony than Dr. Liddicoat or Professor Liddicoat or something like that. Yeah, I really just like to say at this point a big thank you to you and to Yevgeny for the invitation to be with you. It's been really nice to have this opportunity to talk with you and I didn't, well, sort of get to know you, but it would have been so much nicer to be in Southern California to get to know you. But it's been a really nice experience for me to be here and to talk to you and to think about your questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you to Yevgeny and the Center for Cultures and Languages. And Tony, I hope that our next meeting is in person on a sunny day here in Southern California, or a sunny day there in England or in Australia. I look forward to future collaborations. Thank you so much,
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you so much.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.